Men are digging a second wall, and the second wall changes the meaning of the siege. The first line faces inward, toward the hill town of Alesia and the army trapped inside it. The new one faces outward, toward the open country that may yet send an army to break the siege. Between the two works, Caesar's soldiers hold a ring around the town, defended at front and at rear. They are not simply surrounding Vercingetorix. They are building a place in which they themselves can be surrounded. The place is now generally set around modern Alesia in eastern France, where modern survey has found lines that answer to the fortifications Caesar describes, and this matters because the story of Alesia drifts too easily into theater. The ground keeps dragging it back to a harder subject: distance and slope, ditch and rampart, water, time and food. In Caesar's account, as the modern historians handle it, the inner circuit ran for about 11 miles and carried 23 forts. The outward-facing circuit ran almost 13. The numbers belong to the account Caesar made famous, and they must be read as part of that account. Yet even held under discipline, they describe a siege in which engineering became the battlefield. The strongest image of Alesia is not a charge at a gate. It is a labor force inside a military crisis, throwing up works while the town remains hostile behind them and the relief army begins to exist in every calculation ahead of them. Alesia is the moment when a besieging army becomes a fortified settlement of its own. That is why the opening must stay with the men digging. A wall is commonly the sign that someone wishes to keep danger out. But here the Roman army already stands outside the town, and the second line admits a more alarming truth. The besiegers know they may have to defend themselves against all Gaul while still starving the army inside Alesia. The work is practical before it is symbolic. Earth and timber, ditch, watch post, and ration line become the very shape of Roman survival. Almost everything that can be told of Alesia comes from Caesar's own account, the dominant surviving witness, and anything but a neutral one. His war commentaries belong to a form in which a magistrate set down his own deeds with an eye to colleagues and successors. This is no accident of preservation. It is the kind of text built to preserve information and burnish its author in the same motion. The modern reading is useful here because it does not let the page pretend to be a window without glass. Caesar's text was written for a Latin reading elite, and its third-person manner creates an effect of objectivity while quietly arranging the reader's attention around Caesar. The voice seems cool because the political work is being done by form, by selection, and by grammar. That audience explains why the siege can be technical and political on the same page. A Roman reader could admire the neatness of the works, the containment of a dangerous enemy, and the composure of the commander who reports it all in the third person. The calm surface is part of the persuasion. Caesar has no need to shout when the form itself keeps presenting him as the man through whom disorder becomes arrangement. At Alesia, that grammar matters. In Caesar's descriptions of the Rhine bridge and of the Alesia fortifications alike, Caesar stands as the subject of the active verbs of making. The engineering is therefore double: the physical work in earth and timber, and the literary work by which the commander becomes the maker of the scene. None of this makes the siege imaginary. It makes the siege dangerous to narrate carelessly. The moderns warn that Caesar had every incentive to enlarge enemy numbers, to frame enemy motives, and to make his own decisions appear inevitable, and they use him nonetheless, because the works, the sequence, and parts of the ground can be checked. A careful account treats Caesar as evidence under inspection, not as a voice from above. Rule is simple enough to keep the story honest. Where Caesar's account gives a number that enlarges Caesar's achievement, the number stays marked as Caesar's number. Where a speech appears at a moment when the author was not present, the speech stays marked as literary construction. Where the ground, the archaeology, or an operational reading supports the mechanism may carry weight. Alesia survives this discipline because its most important facts are not decorative. They are works on a hillside. Nor does the discipline diminish Caesar's achievement. It makes the achievement harder to sentimentalize. If the account is a political object, the earthworks are the part of the object that can be tested most firmly against ground, against logistics, against later analysis. The page wants Caesar to appear as the maker of order. The hillside shows what that order required: labor and timber, water, the control of food, and a double perimeter that could fail at more points than one commander could personally stand upon. The country around Alesia was no empty stage awaiting Roman order. By the end of the 2nd century BC, many communities of Gaul lived in what the Romans called oppida, large, walled, nucleated settlements. They supplied the things war needs before any campaign becomes visible in a Roman account: recruiting centers, secure stores of food, and iron weapons. The walls themselves deserve a pause. Caesar's description of Gallic walls gives structures of cut timber, stone, and turf, and Gallic building was not Roman building in another costume, but neither was it primitive scenery. One blunt modern conclusion deserves to stand in the margin of the whole scene. Roman sources loved the idea that Rome brought civilization to Gaul, and the evidence does not support the story. An oppidum was a military asset because it gathered what an army consumes faster than a speech can name. Men could be recruited there, food could be stored there, iron weapons could be forged, mended, collected, and issued there. When Caesar at last traps Alesia, he is not trapping a picturesque hill village. He is putting an organized Gallic stronghold under the pressure of the ration. That correction changes the whole siege. If Gaul is imagined as empty country, Roman engineering looks like order imposed on blank ground. If Gaul is seen as a landscape of walled centers and supply depots, ironwork, roads, bridges, coinage, mounted followings, and aristocratic networks, then Alesia becomes a collision between two organized systems. Caesar's army is not solving the problem of disorder. It is breaking a political and logistical order grown strong enough to threaten its own. The same correction comes from another angle. Gallic society held large coalitions and a high order of political organization, mounted retainer bands, roads and bridges, surplus production, and a developed coinage. Caesar's conquest could be funded out of Gallic wealth because the wealth was already there. That complexity complicates Caesar's own success. Gallic aristocrats with their mounted retinues could be recruited as Roman auxiliaries, and Gallic cavalry had become an important arm of Caesar's own army. The line between Roman power and Gallic society was never a simple boundary between conqueror and conquered. Caesar's machine drew upon the very landscape it was breaking. Vercingetorix enters this story as an organizer before he becomes a besieged figure. The revolt of 52 BC opens at Cenabum, modern Orleans, and many tribes of central Gaul answered it. The tribes elected Vercingetorix commander-in-chief, and he assessed what each tribe could supply. The rebellion had the shape of a logistics problem before ever it had the shape of a last stand. The election matters because it sets Vercingetorix inside coalition politics rather than outside ordinary politics as a lone war leader, and the assessment of tribal supply matters more still for Alesia. It shows a commander thinking in grain and horses, manpower, deadlines, and obligations. Vercingetorix needs no ornament. What survives already gives him the seriousness of a man trying to make a coalition work under pressure. Coalition command is a difficult kind of strength. It can raise a wider resistance than any single tribe could mount, but it must convert separate obligations into one campaign, and every tribe that can supply men or grain can also hesitate, bargain, or fail to arrive at the right place in the right hour. That tension will return at the relief line, where the size of the coalition matters less than whether its parts can strike together. The plan attributed to Vercingetorix was no theatrical refusal to fight. Caesar has him urge the abandonment of towns unless their fortifications and natural defenses made them safe, and the concentration of effort against Roman foragers, and the operational soundness of the plan may plausibly be his own. The practical edge is plain. If Caesar lost his baggage, the campaign could be finished for the year. The road to Alesia was therefore already a road through failures of supply and exposed systems. At Avaricum, Caesar faced shortage of grain before he took the town's stores. At Gergovia, the high plateau made assault difficult, and Caesar held back from extensive siege works until his supplies were sure. Gergovia stands as his first outright defeat in Gaul, and the losses are given as 700 men and 36 centurions. Gergovia also teaches the eye how to look at Alesia. A high place is not a mood, it is a construction problem. A siege work is not a display of Roman will, it is a commitment of labor that must be fed while it is being made. The defeat before Alesia matters because it keeps the later Roman engineering from sounding effortless. Caesar came to the final siege having been shown that terrain, supply, and local resolve could refuse his timetable. And the losses at Gergovia are more than a prelude to revenge. They are a warning about the cost of forcing ground too quickly. 700 men and 36 centurions give the setback its hard edge, and the supply framing shows why Caesar could not simply build wherever and whenever he wished. Siege works ask for food and time, animals, tools, and security for the men doing the digging. Alesia would be bolder than Gergovia. It would not be weightless. The political landscape then became a supply landscape. The Aedui took over Caesar's supply base and handed remounts, supplies, and Gallic hostages to Vercingetorix. That is the world Caesar brought to Alesia, not a clean march toward an inevitable victory, but a campaign in which allies, animals, grain, and hostage networks could turn into military facts overnight. By this point, both commanders were fighting through the same material vocabulary. Vercingetorix hunted Roman foragers and baggage. Caesar hunted the stores that could keep his army moving. Allies were not decorative names in a campaign report. They were the people who could provide grain, remounts, hostages, and roads, or take them away at the hour the army needed them most. The final movement can be framed plainly. In 52 BC, Vercingetorix tried to starve Caesar's army into submission by cutting it from its supplies. Caesar pursued the withdrawing Gallic army and at last cornered it in the hill town of Alesia. The town was therefore no mere symbol. It was the point at which two strategies of supply collided. The first decisive pressure came before the first wall was finished. The siege was unexpected, supplies were everything, and Vercingetorix sent his cavalry away to raise the wider support of Gaul. Once those riders were gone, Alesia ceased to be a closed siege. It became a timed machine, food inside the town, construction outside it, and a relief force somewhere beyond sight. The weeks that followed saw little fighting and a great deal of engineering, and that sentence governs the center of the story. The drama of Alesia is not that Romans and Gauls were brave, which is too small a thing to say of either side. The drama is that the Romans answered a moving strategic problem with a fixed artificial landscape. The decision was audacious, because fixed works usually draw their power from being finished before the enemy can change the problem, and at Alesia the problem kept changing while the works were still being made. The town inside needed food, the cavalry that had left needed time, the relief force beyond needed a place to gather. The Roman soldiers needed to build fast enough that the siege could become a machine before the machine itself was attacked. The record describes a complicated series of dry ditches and a diverted stream filling a moat, turreted battlements and deep moats, high ramparts, iron spikes, caltrops, and camouflaged pits of sharpened stakes. A system, in one reading of Caesar's climax, of walls and trenches and man-traps. The vocabulary is severe because the work was severe. Each feature changes the kind of time the siege uses. A ditch slows a rush, a water-filled moat makes the approach heavier, a camouflaged pit turns open ground into a question, a fort divides the circuit into posts that can be watched and reinforced. These are not colorful accessories around a battle. They are the battle's grammar, for they decide how quickly men can move, where they can stand, and how much warning a commander receives. The works multiply tasks besides. Someone must cut the timber and carry the baskets, dig the ditches and set the stakes, guard the unfinished stretches, watch the town, watch the countryside, and keep the army fed while all of it happens. The famous lines did not draw themselves upon a map. They were made by soldiers who became laborers and sentries at once, turning muscle into fortification under the pressure of an approaching army. Those miles-long circuits, in the figures Caesar made famous, were studded with forts at intervals, 23 of them on the inner line alone. The numbers are Caesar's, not neutral arithmetic, yet they force the eye to scale the problem rightly. Alesia was not one wall, it was a system of intervals, each fort a post to be watched and reinforced. The Roman army now lived between the works it had made, one line watching the town, the other watching Gaul, the same men digging, guarding, foraging, eating, sleeping, and standing ready against attack from either direction. The ring was protection, and it was a trap as well, if time, relief, or coordination turned against them. That is why the second wall is more than an addition to the first. The inward line turns Alesia into a closed store of dwindling supplies. The outward line turns the countryside into an approaching threat that must attack through prepared works. Caesar's army remains the besieger, and its position has become defensive in every practical sense. It must hold what it has built long enough for hunger and failed coordination to do their work. The belt between the lines, therefore, becomes the true Roman camp, not safe in any ordinary sense, but safe only while the works hold in both directions and reserves can move faster than breaches open. The longer the circuit, the more control it seems to offer, and the more places it creates where the line runs thin. The brilliance of Alesia cannot be separated from that risk. The relief army arrives first as a number, and the number wears a warning label. The tradition preserves Caesar's claim of a Gallic host 250,000 strong, and the modern caution beside it that Caesar inflated enemy numbers by a factor of 3 at the least. The safest way to carry the figure is to leave it in Caesar's mouth. In his telling, the host was enormous. In ours, the important fact is that the outward wall was no longer theoretical. Skepticism does not require replacing Caesar's number with a tidier modern guess. The honest claim is the narrow one. Caesar reported an immense host, and the moderns warn that his enemy totals run high. Whatever the true count, the engineering fact stands. The Roman army had built an outward line because a relief force might come, and when it came, the line had to become a working fortress. The number keeps its force in the telling because it shows what Caesar wished the reader to feel, scale pressing against order. A vast Gallic host makes the Roman line more remarkable, and Caesar's mastery of the scene more impressive. The discipline is to keep that effect visible without becoming its servant. The relief army was real enough to force a crisis. Caesar's arithmetic belongs to Caesar's reputation as much as to the field. The record names figures among the relief commanders, Epaudorix and Viridomarus, Vercingetorix and Camillus, and the names matter because they keep the relief force from dissolving into one undifferentiated crowd. This was coalition war, and coalition war had to solve the same practical problems Caesar did: where to strike, when to strike, and how to make separated forces act as one instrument. The central difficulty can be said plainly: effective coordination proved impossible. The intention was clear enough: the relief force striking the Roman lines from without while the Gauls inside pressed from within, the Romans standing to their fortifications between. The decisive action, therefore, remains an action around works. The question is never who wants victory more. The question is whether pressure from two sides can open one engineered system. That problem of coordination is easily swallowed by scale. A great coalition could fill the horizon and still fail to become one timed blow. The defenders within had to strike the inward-facing works, the relief had to strike the outward-facing works, and the Romans between had to judge where the pressure was real and where the reserves must go. Alesia becomes a problem of separated sightlines and unequal timing, which is exactly the kind of problem earthworks are made to exploit. The two Gallic pressures were dangerous because either could make the other decisive. If the force inside Alesia broke the inward line, the siege collapsed. If the relief broke the outward line, Caesar's soldiers would be trapped inside their own belt. But each pressure had also to cross distance, ground, obstacle, and uncertainty, and the walls made the two attacks visible to the Romans as separate emergencies before they could become one. The third assault found the dangerous place. It fell upon a stretch of the Roman fortifications weaker than the rest, and the structural reason mattered. The Roman troops were too few to hold the whole line at once. A double wall solves one problem by creating another. It extends control and extends vulnerability with it. The reading that keeps the crisis in engineering terms is the right one. The climax is defined by fortifications and ramparts, trenches, man-traps, and a Gallic ramp, and even where the account tightens around decisions of command, it is the objects on the ground that do the work of the scene. The Roman line is not a painted backdrop to courage. It is the thing that is failing or holding. The account places Caesar at a post identified with Mount Flavigny, from which he could watch the battle unfold and direct his reinforcements, with the standing warning that the whole scene is shaped by Caesar's own understanding of generalship. The scene belongs inside that frame. Caesar appears exactly where Caesar's account requires him, seeing, ordering, correcting, arriving. In that same account, Labienus had gathered 11 cohorts as a reserve against the moment the fortifications might fail. The detail matters because it rescues the scene from a simple tale of personal intervention. The line survives through reserves and timing, through local command, and through the moving of men to the place where the works can no longer do enough alone. The reserve shows the limit of the works themselves. Ditches and ramparts can slow, expose, channel, and divide an attack. They cannot decide of themselves when a weakened sector needs men. That decision belongs to commanders reading ground under stress. The Caesar of the account watches from his height and directs the reinforcement, and the Caesar of the page is also the author who has arranged matters so that command and construction meet in his person. Labienus' reserve matters for the same reason. 11 cohorts are held back because no commander can make every part of a long circuit equally strong. The reserve is a movable answer to a fixed problem. It can be sent where the works are failing, and it works only if someone has read the ground rightly and the line has bought time enough for men to arrive. The record then describes German cavalry sweeping around the rear of Vercingetorix warriors. That movement can swallow the siege whole if it is made the climax. It is better understood as the final change of pressure in a system already at its limit. The works held long enough for movement outside the works to matter. The relief army withdrew the next day, and the battle was over in the only sense that mattered for Alesia. The wall had done its brutal arithmetic. It had converted the scale of a coalition into a difficulty of coordination, and converted Roman danger into a narrow belt of controlled movement. The Roman victory at the relief line therefore belongs in the same category as the ditches that preceded it. It was a management of movement. The defenders within could not break out, the army without could not break in, and the Romans between them could shift reserves and cavalry while the two Gallic pressures failed to combine into one breach. The result was not the destruction of an enemy army in the field. The result was that the siege still existed the next morning. That is a colder kind of victory than battle painting usually wants. No single instant explains it. The line holds because many small delays accumulate: a ditch that slows men, a pit that breaks a formation, a weak sector reinforced in time, a cavalry stroke arriving behind a pressure point, an inside attack missing the outside blow by an hour. The victory is not one gesture. It is a system surviving stress. Before the surrender comes the cost, the siege made visible. The famous speech in which a Gallic noble counsels cannibalism is treated by the modern reading as invention. The expulsion of the town's civilians is treated as observable fact, and the distinction is necessary. The speech belongs to Caesar's literary arrangement. The people between the lines belong to the siege. The civilians were left in the dead ground between the two camps, and the Romans would not let them pass. This is one of the places where admiration for the engineering becomes harder, not easier. The line is not only a clever work, it is a device that decides who may pass, who may eat, and who can be forced into the space between two refusals. There is no need to linger over the suffering. The fact is severe enough stated plainly. In the sober reconstruction, Vercingetorix expelled the civilians because food inside Alesia had become part of the siege's arithmetic, and Caesar's line refused them passage because his own calculation allowed no relief through the works. The walls did what walls do. They sorted bodies into inside, outside, and nowhere. This is the point at which engineering loses its last innocence. The same works that protected Roman soldiers and trapped the armed defenders also decided the fate of people who were useless to the ration count within and forbidden the country without. The siege did not need theatrical cruelty to be cruel in effect. Its cruelty was procedural: gate, ditch, refusal, hunger, and no passage. After the relief army withdrew, Vercingetorix agreed to surrender. The famous image of him riding out in his finest armor belongs to the later tradition, carried by Cassius Dio, and not to anything Caesar himself records. It belongs to the afterlife of Alesia, and it cannot be smuggled into the account as eyewitness certainty. The sources resist two caricatures: Vercingetorix, the doomed barbarian prince, and Caesar the villain at the frame's edge. They give a harder and more useful picture. Vercingetorix organized supply and coalition, cavalry and terrain, until his system was trapped inside Caesar's, and Caesar answered with a system of works effective, adaptable, and ruthless enough to leave civilians between the lines. The surrender did not end the cost. Caesar separated the Aedui and Arvani captives to serve as hostages rather than be sold. Other warriors were given over as slaves, and the whole belongs inside the wider economy of the Gallic campaigns, in which hundreds of thousands of captives were sold and Caesar amassed a vast fortune. The distinction between hostage and slave is no softening of the conquest. It is a reminder that Caesar's victory became political management on the spot. Some captives were held because their communities still mattered to the settlement of Gaul, others were treated as spoil. The same victory that produced thanksgiving at Rome produced human property, negotiated submission, and wealth for the commander who had written the campaign into Roman memory. The aftermath therefore belongs inside the siege, not after it. Alesia's lines turned military control into categories of disposal. Aedui and Arvani captives could become hostages because their political usefulness had survived defeat. Other warriors became slaves because conquest had made them movable property. The categories are administrative, and the administration is the violence taking its final form. The tradition gives Vercingetorix 6 years in chains and sets his execution after Caesar's Gallic triumph in 46 BC. The ending is easy to overplay because later memory has already composed it for us. The quieter version is the more severe. A commander who had once organized a coalition across all Gaul, reduced to a captive kept against the day when another man's victory required display. Rome voted Caesar a thanksgiving of 20 days. That, too, is part of the siege's cost, because it shows where the report finally landed. A system of ditches and ramparts in Gaul became political capital at Rome. The engineering did not stay on the hill. And the thanksgiving returns us to the problem of the source. Caesar's account traveled toward the same political world that voted him honor. The works around Alesia were not only built, but reported, interpreted, and turned into reputation. That does not make the earthworks unreal. It makes their afterlife part of the operation. The surviving ground around Alesia Saint-Triani is a useful correction to triumphal memory. It does not let Alesia become only the moment when Caesar wins or Vercingetorix falls. It preserves the shape of the problem: a town on a hill, a Roman ring around it, an outward line against Gaul, and a narrow, occupied belt where soldiers tried to outbuild time. The ground keeps the source problem visible too. Caesar's account gives the works their famous scale and sequence. The modern historians keep asking what the account is doing even as they use it. And the earthworks, the survey traces, and the careful readings let the account hold two truths at once. Alesia was a real operation of remarkable technical control, and its most influential narrator had every reason to make that control look like Caesar's native element. The traces do not answer every question. They do something more limited and more valuable. They keep the siege from floating entirely inside Caesar's prose. A line in the ground is not a neutral witness, but it is a different kind of witness from a political memoir. It lets the engineering stay concrete while the telling remains under inspection. Caesar's army after Gaul was efficient, loyal, and willing to fight his political enemies. The crossing of the Rubicon is set around the 10th of January, 49 BC, with the standing caution that later additions to the scene show what Romans thought such a moment ought to contain. Alesia did not mechanically cause the civil war. It helped make the army, the wealth, the reputation, and the political danger with which Caesar came down to the river. The two walls are the honest monument, because they hold the contradiction without smoothing it. They show Roman technical brilliance and Roman coercion in one object: Vercingetorix's coalition pressed by hunger and Caesar's army pressed by relief. A siege machine that saved Roman lives by making other lives immovable, and by making every attempted passage expensive, until surrender or breakout should decide the matter. The last image of Alesia is therefore neither a heroic tableau nor a moral drawn on a ruin. It is a set of lines on the ground. One line faces the people trapped inside, One line faces the people coming to save them, and between the two, Caesar's soldiers build, wait, ration, and hold. The siege is famous because it ended a revolt. It is more revealing because it shows how conquest can look like engineering, until the human cost begins to press against the ditch.